It's 12 o'clock. Thank you for coming here to this special interest event, which is organized by the Committee of Higher Education of FENS, the CHET committee. And we are organizing a special interest event on the effects of fake news on the brain. And we are very proud that there is such a huge turn up here. So it's a very interesting special interest event. We have 3 speakers, and due to time, I would like to start with the first speaker, which is Andrea Grignoli Corsini from University of San Raffaele in Milano, and he will give an overview of the history and the definition of fake news. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, fake news existed since a long time. The most famous, probably, first fake news is the donation of Constantine during the Renaissance. It was a forged Roman Empire imperial decree pretended to transfer the control over the whole Western Roman Empire to the Pope. And a rhetorician, Lorenzo Valla, discovered that it was a fake news. Another very important, I'm just jumping into the history, which is quite atypical, but just to give you an idea, the Protocol of Elders of Zion, published in Russia, of course it was an anti-Semitic text purporting to explain a Jewish scheme to a global dominance. And it was discovered to be, of course, plagiarized several earlier sources, some of which were not anti-Semitic. So this is a typical cherry-picking mechanism. So here we already have some recurrent issues. Fake news tends to create dynamics of exclusion between different social groups, consist of manipulated information, something with real, other with manufactured origin, created for political purpose, and can last over time despite the denials. We have the first wave of modern fake news during 18th century. We notice that public print newspapers tabloid based on false and distorted news, preferring sensationalism and gossip instead of facts, in order, again, to have and orient social consensus. This has been called yellow journalism. We are arrived to nowadays the most famous recent events are the fake news used to support Brexit. There is a lot of literature on this topic. And of course also to the election of President Donald Trump. The most famous fake news is the one that that criticized the fraud concerning the citizenship of Barack Obama. And this is, again, we see that issue of fake news prompt the populist drift. And at this time reach the center of political stage. So according to Cambridge Dictionary, fake news is false stories that appear to be news spread on the internet or using other media, usually created to influence political views or as a joke. This is another important point. But again, we see that the affecting election results became an important topic. So these are few characteristics of fake news. They are due to a new social media-driven news ecosystem, and we see that information reach either individuals and be global. We see here that the propagation is on viral waves, the contagious flames, and 2 very important points are that this kind of information is distributed in group of membership, reciprocally opposed, in clusters. which create a continuous series of novelty-based, non-mainstream, another important point, counter-information, which is quite typical in conspiracy thinking, and subsequent denials which are reciprocally ignored, creating echo chambers, motivated reasoning, etc. And this is at the end create a problem concerning experts, and nowadays competences and experts are ignored or even mocked. So there are a lot of documents trying to understanding the definition of fake news. European Council and several papers, use this threefold distinction. We have we don't have to use, according to this research, fake news, which is a general term. We have to use, information disorders. But what does it mean? Misinformation, a false information network without intent, disinformation with intent, and malinformation, which is true news but adapted, modified to pollute the debate. There is now a sort of science of site news, of fake news. This is a paper from Science, and you see we have discovered that falsehoods spread much more and faster than the truth in science. Why? Because people respond to fake news especially with surprise and disgust. This is a central topic in neuroethics, the disgust problem. Let's go ahead. So here we go, fake news and science. There are several topics particularly affected by fake news. I decided just to mention, to give a cursory mention to vaccines, animal experimentation, animal testing, and alternative therapies. If we see vaccine, of course, impure vaccine constituents into human blood, it's an old story. Nowadays we use poisonous synthetic metals or aborted fetuses within the vaccine, but in the old time there was the very same topic concerning the promiscuity and bestialization of between animal and human blood by using cowpox vaccine, and also the very famous Andrew Wakefield's fraud concerning the fake relationship between autism and MMR vaccine. Timing is very important. We will discuss at the end probably, but the Lancet took 12 years to retract this fake paper, this fraud. And this is very important to clean the field immediately. I have to go to the end. Animal experimentation, again, these are recurrent strategies insisting on pets, which are actually 1 or 3% of the total, or insisting on puppies, on abuse, on welfare, again insisting, triggering moral disgust. And recurrent, this is a very famous case in Italy, supporting with fake news alternative therapies to fake stem cell infusion for neurodegenerative disease. We were about to collapse because they were very close to be funded by Parliament with 3 million euros. So these are the conclusions. So sometimes we have to think of ourselves a little bit, because a part of the origin of the fake news are scientific fraud. We have to insist on research integrity. But of course we have also to prepare the society with science and health literacy. The knowledge divide, the problem concerning, if you look at GMO vaccine, climate change, the approach which divides scientists and lay citizens are very, very different. So this is the concluding remarks. So if we have to, isolate, to single out the elements, the features of the fake news, in the history we see this point, the arousal of emotional stimuli, using information novelty and surprise, which is quite typical of conspirational theories and stories, triggering disgust and purity, child protection, natural food, aborted fetus, poisonous constituents, and polarizing news, reinforcing in-group versus out-group, and then move towards tribalism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andrea, for this nice overview. Since this is a special interest event, we will not have questions in between the speakers, but we will have a discussion at the end of all speakers. So now I would like to ask forward Maria De Luca from the University of Cagliari in Italy, and she will tell us what is happening in our brain when there is fake news presented. These are the wrong slides. Can that be changed? Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and I really thank you, the organizing of the FENS meeting and the organizing of this special event. I'm trying to briefly show you some neural system and mechanism that influence what people believe. And as Professor Grignolio told us before, fake news are very, very old. In fact, believing or sharing fake news is strictly related to important components of human evolution. So daily widespread distribution of fake news by social networks, but not only, of course, mainly Facebook, Twitter, to name a few, may reflect two basic aspects. The first important aspect that I'd like to highlight is the novelty of the information itself. People are very attracted from originality, salience, and expectancy. And the novelty is therefore provided with positive motivational value. And in addition, the motivation to be part of a group by sharing common information is related to sociability. In this nice paper that I selected for you that go deeply into the psychology of fake news, it is clear that people are able to recognize the accuracy of information. So when the subjects in the study were asked to respond if information was true or false, they did that with a certain accuracy. But when they were asked if they wanted to share or not, they decide to share both the true and false information. Therefore, social media sharing does not necessarily imply belief, and people share news regardless of whether it is true or false. And when in another study then was measured the EEG activity in brain cortexes, there was a comparison between what was true and false, and during the method credibility evaluation, the same cortical areas, please focus your attention on the green areas and the yellow one, were activated. So no matter if the message again was true or false. And going deeply with another very nice study from Lauren Sherman and her collaborators that this time studied the activity or press the button like the whole of you in the audience, I'm sure, know, and discovered that during the likes there was a heavily activation of the ventral striatum and the ventromedial prefrontal cortical areas. That also is linked to sociability again. So in preclinical study, we were able to understand in many years of studies that these two areas, so the prefrontal cortical areas and the ventral striatal areas, are heavily innervated by dopamine and modulated also by glutamate transmission. And we, in a study of many years ago, we studied the effect of novelty, the impact of a novel, salient, and unexpected stimulus stimulus on the dopamine transmission of the rat. And we observed that during the first exposure of the stimulus, all the dopaminergic area that I have mentioned, so the nucleus accumbens, shell and core, and prefrontal cortex responds with an increase of dopamine. But during the second exposure, so when the stimulus was not novel anymore, the shell underwent to a phenomenon that we term habituation, displaying a lack of increase of dopamine toward the stimulus. We also discovered that bilateral lesion with 6-hydroxydopamine in the medial prefrontal cortex induce an abolishment of this phenomenon of the habituation. So we studied that the novelty was able to stimulate the dopamine release in these two areas, and that this phenomenon was modulated by the intact dopamine transmission in the prefrontal cortex. So dopamine demonstrates an opposite releasing patterns to novelty in the medial prefrontal cortex and in the nucleus accumbens. So this observation, to try to reconnect with our topic, support for sure the role of the dopamine in the impact of novelty, such was the first chocolate exposure, suggests that the medial prefrontal cortex, the dopamine inhibits the effect observed in the nucleus accumbens, so in the ventral striatal areas, when the stimulus is not novel anymore, and may be useful to partially understand why the first respond to fake news and to beliefs affect cortical and subcortical regions and drive the humans to spread the information by the classical like and share activity. And of course, future clinical studies can clarify the behavioral and brain responses to this second exposure to fake news, so to understand the elaboration of the message. And although dopamine is very important, it would be also very important to understand how this neurotransmitter interacts with other neurotransmitters, maybe the oxytocin, for example, that is very important in sociability and in interaction with other components of the social group. So I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. And then after we have seen what is happening in the brain, we are going to look at how fake news changes the brain and creates false memories in the brain. And that's going to be presented by Ciara Greene from University College Dublin in Ireland.
Hello, everybody. Very nice to be here today, and I'd like to thank FENS for inviting me. So my colleagues this morning have given us a good overview about what fake news is and where it's come from, and how it is processed in the brain. So what I want to talk about now is one of the potential consequences of exposure to fake news or misinformation or disinformation, and that's the formation of false memories. So essentially what I'm going to tell you today and what I'm going to show you through a series of different studies is that when people see fabricated news stories or even doctored photographs of events that never took place, they can not only come to believe that those events happened, but they can actually form a detailed memory of having experienced those events in the first place. And what we know is that those false memories are especially likely if the content of that fabricated material is consistent with your existing views of the world. So if it lines up with your ideology, your perspectives, your prejudices, whatever it might be, you're going to be more likely to form a false memory. Now, everybody in this room, or most people in this room, are neuroscientists, so you will know that memory is not stored intact in one place in the brain. Instead, memories are stored in distributed fashion throughout the brain, and every time we remember something, we actually reconstruct that memory. So a lot of the time when I ask, undergrads or members of the public to give me a metaphor for memory, they'll say, oh, it's like a video, and you can rewind it back and forth, and you see the same events in the same place every time. Or else they might say, it's like a box, and you put it in a suitcase, and you put that suitcase up in the attic, and then when you want to remember something, well, you take it back down, and there it is, still in the box. But of course, as we all know, that's not the case. So the metaphor that I prefer for memory is the Lego tower. So that we have these blocks of memory, these sort of pieces of memory that are distributed throughout the brain. When we go to recall something, we reconstruct that memory. And when we reconstruct that Lego tower, we tend to do it in line with our idea of what a Lego tower should look like. So, and that idea, those blueprints that we have for our memories are our schemas. They're based on our experiences and our knowledge about the world. So my schema, my blueprint for a Lego tower is going to be different to yours. So my reconstructed memory will differ from yours. Now, because we reconstruct those memories in line with our existing schemas, that means we're going to tend to construct them in a way that confirms what we already believe to be true. So I'm going to show you a few examples of that from some recent work conducted by, in my lab and with some of my collaborators. So one of the first studies we did on this was in 2018, and this was around the Irish abortion referendum. Some of you might have heard of this. It was a big national referendum to legalise abortion. It was a very contentious issue, as you might imagine. So in the week before the referendum, we gave people a whole load of different news items, and then mixed in among some true news items, we made up some items. And these are just an example of some fake news items we made up. So we told people either that the Yes campaign or the No campaign were forced to destroy campaign posters after it was discovered that they were paid for by American lobbyists. This isn't true. We made this up. Okay. After each story, we asked people, do they remember the events described in the story? And they could answer from a number of different options. But these top two options here, if people said they had a clear memory of seeing or hearing about it, or if they didn't remember seeing or hearing it, but they remember that the event happened, we coded those as a memory. So importantly, we didn't include just people saying, oh, I believe this happened or it feels familiar. We asked them where they heard about it, and then we asked them how they felt about it at the time, and they could write that down. And then what we can see here is that on the whole, we found that people were much more likely to falsely remember the fake story that was in line with their own views. So, for example, yes voters, shown here in the green bars, were much more likely to remember a scandal that reflected badly on the no campaign and vice versa. And we found that regardless of how we defined memory. If we defined it very narrowly as a very specific memory, or even more broadly, or even if we just looked at people who believed that the event happened. We looked at used a similar experimental design in a study about Brexit. So here we came up with fake stories suggesting either that there was a WikiLeaks revelation about illegal campaign donations to either the Leave or the Remain campaign. Another fake story about election tampering, that 1,000 ballots were found thrown away in a bin outside a polling station. Again, we made these stories up. And once again, what we find is that participants reported more false memories for ideologically congruent stories. So the blue bars here are stories that fit with the participants' ideology. So that's for Leave voters, that's a story that reflected badly on the Remain campaign. For Remain voters, it's a story about a scandal affecting the Leave campaign. So people were more likely to remember the ideologically congruent stories. I don't have time to go into the details on this now, but we also found that those effects were stronger if we experimentally manipulated participants' sense of threat about their identity as either a Leaver or a Remainer. So we activated that sense of feeling a need to defend their particular ideology. More recently, this paper is still under review. We looked at this very similar design again, looking at COVID-19 misinformation. This time we gave people, amidst a whole load of other stories, we gave them either pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine misinformation headlines. So, for example, you can see here, these are two stories about the effects of the mRNA technology in the new COVID vaccines. One saying that it'll triple your natural immunity and protect you from all diseases. Another saying it'll harm and stress your immune system and make you more susceptible to other diseases. Neither of these are true. The COVID vaccine, of course, is targeted to a particular virus. So in this case, we looked at participants who had previously reported whether they were generally pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. So the blue bars here are people who were generally in favour of COVID vaccines. The red bar is people who are not in favour of them. And you can see a very nice clear effect here where those pro-vax participants were about twice as likely to remember the pro-vax headline than the anti-vax headline. And we see the opposite effect there where anti-vax people remember the anti-vax headline much more frequently than the pro-vax, with the neutral people being somewhere in the middle. And just in case you're thinking, oh, well, just ticking a box doesn't really tell us much about memory, we also asked people to tell us how they felt about each of these events. And we just have some nice examples here. I really like this one there in the red. And this is from the Brexit study, somebody who said they were an employee of the council, the county council in question, where these ballots were supposed to have been thrown away. And they said, oh, I was an employee there, and I thought at the time this was all overstated. Anybody could have put those ballots there. This never happened. We made this up. And in the purple there from the abortion study, someone saying, I don't think anything wrong happened. The posters shouldn't have been burned. Well, we never told them the posters were burned. So this is someone confabulating that extra information for themselves and constructing that detailed memory. So why is this important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is that false memories can sometimes influence our behaviour. So, for example, there's a nice body of research showing that if you can get somebody to form a false memory that they once got sick after eating a particular food, like strawberry ice cream or peach yogurt, they're going to be less favourable to that food in future. And critically, they'll also, if you bring them back to a totally separate experiment later on, they'll eat less of that food if you give it to them. So there's good evidence that it might affect our behaviour. So we thought, well, maybe we might see stronger behavioural effects among participants who form false memories for fake news. So this is another COVID-19 study. I only want to talk about this one very briefly. In this case, we had 4 fake stories, 2 designed to get people to increase their behaviour of something, to eat more spicy food or to drink more coffee, 2 designed to get you to reduce your behaviour, to be less likely to download a contact tracing app or less likely to get vaccinated. And critically, we had half of our participants, so each participant saw 2 out of these 4 stories. So for each story, half of the sample had seen it and half hadn't, and that meant we were able to compare the effect of exposure. After each story, in addition, we asked them the memory questions I showed you before. We also asked them about their behavioural intentions, and highlighted in red here are those critical intentions related to the fake stories. So I intend to drink more coffee, I intend to get a COVID-19 vaccine, and so on. So overall what we found was exposure to the misinformation had small but measurable effects on some behavioural intentions. This is a one-shot single exposure to a novel story. And we found those effects were roughly in the region of about 5%. So that's pretty small, so it's nothing to get too excited about, but 5% at a population level in something like vaccination is potentially very important. So that is something we want to be aware of. For what I want to talk about today, I want to focus on just among those people who did see the fake stories. We compared those people who said, yes, I saw this and I remember having seen it when it happened, with the people who we showed the story to who said, no, I don't remember this ever having happened. And there what we found is that experiencing a false memory produced additional effects for some of these behavioural intentions, but not others, so it's not hugely reliable. And then we saw, these effects were kind of relatively large, so say a 12% increase in people's intention to drink more coffee, or an 8% reduction in their willingness to download a contact tracing app if they remembered having seen a story saying that there were problems with that app. So that's all from me. I just really want to acknowledge my primary collaborator on all of this work, who's Dr. Gillian Murphy in University College Cork, who's co-author on all of these studies, and then all of our other collaborators who were involved in some or all of these different projects. So I'd be very happy to take any questions in the session to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ciara. We open the session now for questions. If you have a question, please come to a microphone and phrase your question. And to start off, I have questions here that came in by the app. One is a very interesting question, I think. It's about if the dopamine system is involved in habituation and probably our reactions towards fake news, do we know if Parkinson patients are reacting in a different way towards fake news? Can somebody... I'm looking to you, Maria. You just have to press.
Yes, of course. No, we don't know actually, as far as I know, if Parkinson disease patients have a more prone attitude to consider the fake news. For sure, the areas that I have mentioned are areas implicated also in the reward and in the like. We don't know actually if when the brain and the people decide to follow a false or fake news are also feeling pleasure. We cannot tell that the reward, but for sure these circuits that are phylogenetically very ancient and very important to, in particular the ventral striatum, to respond to all the natural stimulus that are important for the prosecution of the species are particularly stimulated. So probably some disease that affect in an important way the dopaminergic system can highlight this tendency, but I don't have a perfect response on that.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over here.
So thank you for a very interesting set of talks. I was particularly interested in the false memories, and it has been shown in the extremism literature, for example, that certain types of cognitive phenotypes are more likely to go towards extremism. So cognitive inflexibility, for example, is predictive of endorsing extremism. With the individual differences in false memories, are there any differences in those who are more susceptible versus resilient? And could that be used to target interventions to protect against fake news?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is both yes and no. So the first thing is to say that everybody is susceptible to false memories. Okay, so most people, it's one of those things that everyone goes, oh yes, that happens to other people, but my memories are perfect, thanks very much. But no, we're all susceptible to false memories. Generally we find in any given measure about a quarter of people will fall for anything, and this is both in fake news stuff, in eyewitness memory, false memories, all that stuff. Usually maybe about 25% of people, but a different 25% every time. And there isn't any strong evidence, in fact there's strong evidence that there isn't a false memory trait. So it's not the case that if you're bad at one kind of false memory, you'll be bad at all the others as well. It varies depending on the context. Having said that, there are individual differences that will make you more susceptible to this kind of misinformation that we've been talking about here. So one of them is cognitive style. So people who are more kind of reflective thinkers rather than reflexive. So people who tend to kind of slow down, go with that sort of system 2, think slowly and rationally, tend to be a little bit less susceptible than people who are kind of more the reflexive, go with your gut, because it's that kind of idea of, you take it at face value and go, oh yeah, that feels true. But do you stop and go, well, okay, it feels true, but is it true? There's also, we had really interesting data showing that people who actually knew more about a topic, who were more knowledgeable by an objective measure, were less susceptible to fake news about that topic. But people who thought they knew more were actually more susceptible. So there's that kind of disconnect between your actual knowledge and your objective knowledge and perceived knowledge. So that's one of the difficulties with things like people talking about expertise, because we can become very overconfident in our expertise and think, oh yes, I know lots about this, and then, kind of be more likely to form false memories for it. There's a whole rake of other measures, so general cognitive ability, autobiographical memory, specificity, a lot of different kind of factors that can play into that. So yes, there are individual differences, but those effects tend to be fairly small, and on the whole, it's better to realise that really everyone is susceptible to these, and in particular, everyone is susceptible to those kind of ideological confirmation biases.
Thank you.
So thank you for a great talk. I think it's very important to talk about this topic nowadays. My question resides, I didn't depict the significance. So in the case, for instance, of people that were not, didn't make their minds about a controversial topic, were they more vulnerable to remember false memories towards one side or the other? I was wondering, because whenever there is a controversial question, you have very decisive groups, but also a huge percentage of the population that is still deciding their minds, and here the information can play a huge role.
Yeah, so that it really depends on the materials. So sometimes you'll just have that there are some set of stories that are more plausible than others, and people will be more likely to fall for those. For example, in our COVID studies, you might have seen there that the neutral people were still more likely to rate the pro-vax stories as being more accurate or more likely to remember them than the anti-vax. We would ascribe that to just the sheer weight of media in favour and of providing, the huge efforts to provide accurate information about COVID-19, that really outweighs the misinformation available. So even people who are sort of uncertain are kind of aware that most of the anti-vax stuff isn't really true, that they know there's that anti-vax misinformation, and they're a little bit more suspicious of it. But outside that, the COVID space in general, it really depends on the materials. It's a very specific thing. It's very rare that you'll also find people who are actually 100% completely neutral. It's just neutral relative to something else. So.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your very interesting talks. After all you have explained, my question is, I think we'll all agree that fake news are prejudicial. So is there anything we can do about it, and if it's something that we can do about it, what we could do about it? Thank you.
Andrea, can you?
Well, thank you for your question, which is very, very important. There are a lot of research on how to tackle and solve the problem of fake news. As I mentioned, one thing that we have to do is to clean up the field by, concerning the fraud, because a big part of the fake news originated from scientific fraud. So this is a very important point. Otherwise, we always, think to do something outside our field, but we have to look in our house. And then, health and science literacy appear to be important, especially in the early year of education, because cognitive bias are, very coherent when, we are mature, and then we have to, develop a critical way of thinking and to spread as much as possible scientific methodology starting early in education. And this seems to be helpful, and especially if we also use, the flow of information is not important. I mean, we have a lot of experiment in which, you try to convince hesitant or refusals concerning a vaccine, and you don't reach the point. Because if you have a very deep belief concerning vaccination, if you are really a no-vaxxer, there is no flow of information which is helpful to change idea. Behavioral changing is it's a complex stuff. But the sole tools that seems to be useful is to explain the mechanism of fake news. Not to use counter information, we have to try to avoid correcting information, for instance, by demonstrating that there is no relationship between autism and a certain specific vaccine, but instead explain all the mechanism hidden underneath the fake news, recounts the stories. And in this way, it seems that you can reach some goal. But it's a general, this is a part of our future, efforts to reinforce the critical thinking and scientific methodology early in the schools.
Thank you.
Was there a question on that side? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the talks. My question is in regards to the false memories also. If I understood correctly, the results are based on the assumption that people really saw these headlines for the first time, but are you sure that this is true? Because I cannot comment on the Brexit or abortion ones, but the COVID headlines, especially the anti-vax one, is very popular and circulating on the internet, so people who reported that they saw it might have actually saw it. Like, it's still false, but they did see it. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that most of these studies were conducted a while ago and we're kind of writing them up now. So yeah, so firstly we created fake stories rather than taking debunked ones. And then we did an awful lot of kind of piloting and testing work to make sure that those stories weren't actually available at that time. So we ran our studies within a very short time frame, so within a space of like a few days, and we would go down into about 6 pages down into Google, and if it wasn't available there, we were like, well, no one's really going to have found that, or it's very unlikely they'd have found it.
Okay, thank you.
Question over there.
Thank you. So my question is also directed to Dr. Greene, and it has to do with the fake memories. So everyone has an inset bias, let's say, a cognitive bias towards one side versus the other. And we have this tendency to filter all the incoming information, towards that side of least resistance. So in that case, being encountered with fake news, how much would you say it's actual fake memories or actual manufacturing based on the semantics of encountering the headline?
So in a way, it's kind of the same thing, because it's sort of, if we talk about that idea of the construction of a memory, that what we're saying is essentially what the evidence on this shows is that it begins with that sense of this feels true, and from that then you go through these kind of source monitoring processes, and you start to say, oh yes, I think that feels like it is true, I think it probably is true, and then you start to construct details around it. So I think what's really important is that in our approach anyway, we always distinguish in the questions we ask people between memories and beliefs. So we always ask them very explicitly, do you actually remember this happening, or do you just believe that it did happen? And what we would pre-register in our analysis is that we don't count beliefs as memories, because people are very inclined to believe something, but whether they actually say, yes, I saw this happen. And what we also, I didn't get into it there, I didn't have time, we asked them, well, where did you hear about this? And we looked, did they give us a specific source? And the people who say, yes, they remembered it, very, very high proportion of them will give us a specific source. I saw it on TV, I saw it on BBC News, I read it on Twitter, my friend Ciara told me. So we're pretty confident with those that they actually really are memories, but they're obviously not real memories. It's a memory of something that didn't happen. They are constructed, and we could talk for a long time about the difference between true and false memories, and there are some, on average, there tend to be differences between them, but it's not, the difference between them isn't the truth value. The difference is that the amount of context that you tend to have to go with the true memory tends to be a lot more detailed and a lot richer, because it actually happened and there's context you can draw on. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, and if I may, for a follow-up?
Sure.
My underlying assumption was that, okay, we're testing the memory, we're probing, we're providing more resistance. So in that case, the fabrication of the memories is based on the semantics, and it's semantic versus episodic memory. We do not construct the exact episode of sitting in front of the TV, watching CNN, getting the information, but rather conflating the two just to validate our beliefs even further.
And I don't think we have data to say one way or the other on that, really. I think my guess would be episodic, but I don't think we really have the data to confirm one way or the other.
Okay, thank you.
There's one question there. I don't know if you're standing there a long time, but I don't see you due to the light, so... yeah.
I was just wondering whether you have any significance on susceptibility to fake memories depending on the socioeconomic layer that the participants come from, and maybe the level of education that they've acquired.
Actually, we haven't assessed socioeconomic status, but we have looked at education, and there are minimal effects of education. So sometimes there are some effects. It depends on the topic. So we're doing some on like cancer misinformation, and there is an effect of education. So things that are more scientific, sometimes there is, but it's fairly small. It's a very small effect. On the whole, no, education doesn't have a huge effect.
I see we have 1.5 minutes left, but if your answer is not being addressed here, you can come forward here, and also the people who have put the questions in via the app, we will answer them after the session. So one more question, I think.
Thank you. This is such a relevant topic right now, especially with everything around COVID happening. And I was just wondering, what was your opinion on these big social media platforms that started withdrawing fake news and posing an opinion about what is fake, what is real? What do you answer to that?
Can you really shortly, the essence of the question?
There is a huge echo here. Sorry.
What is your opinion on social media platforms withdrawing certain fake news? Like, where can that lead us in like censoring liberty of expression? Sorry, that's not much shorter, but.
Well, it's a very complicated, it's a political issue. I'm quite a libertarian, so I look, to any imposition concerning or decision concerning information. Even if I hate some information, my idea is to avoid to create a central control structure. So to me is the main point, I will be very short, is to point on education instead of to trying to organize information, because on one time we can agree if some information concerning racism, disgusting stuff is, we are all agree to, cut out this kind of misinformation out of the field. But in some other case, we can have problem concerning democracy or idea that we share, or so it's difficult to support this idea. So to me, instead of pointing on social network platform, we have to react as a citizenship. To me, we have to point on our distributed knowledge.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all the speakers for their presentations. Those who have still questions can come forward here and we can continue the discussion here. The questions submitted via the app will also be addressed. I just received a message from FENS that lunch break has started, so enjoy your lunch all. And I would like to invite you also to a special interest event we organized this evening on paper mill articles in neuroscience. So you're welcome to be there as well. Thank you very much for your attention.